This is Larry Jordan. This speech was presented February 26th at Broadcast Video Expo 2013 in London, and my trip to BVE was sponsored by Blackmagic Design at blackmagicdesign.com. Welcome to 4K Video Workflow, Hype, or Reality. My name is Larry Jordan, and of course 4K is real. The Red One's been shooting 4K for years. Now cameras from GoPro to Sony are shooting 4, 5, even 8K images. You'll be hearing a lot about 4K at this conference, so I want to start by defining terms and establishing a basic foundation so you can ask intelligent questions. For me, the question is not, is 4K real? More importantly, we need to ask, who is 4K for, and what do we need to know to use it successfully? But first, hold your hats. This is the obligatory 4K image shown at a 1:1 pixel ratio at the full resolution of this screen. Ta-da! Look at that detail. Look at the clarity. Look at the information it contains. Except, that's the actual 4K image. That's all I can fit on the screen at this particular point in time. In order for us to see the entire image, I needed to reduce the scale so it would fit on the screen. Essentially, I took a 4K image and reduced it to the equivalent of 720p. This is a 67% reduction in the size of the image. So, what was the advantage of shooting all that extra resolution in the first place? That is the whole point of this presentation. There's really 4 questions this boils down to. First, in production, why are you shooting 4K? The ancillary question is, what version of 4K do you want to shoot? Because there's a lot of options. In post-production, how are you going to edit 4K? Can your storage system even handle 4K data files? When it comes to output, how are you going to output 4K? What format should you master in? And when it comes to distribution, how are you going to distribute 4K? I mean, is it even worth shooting 4K if no one can see it? Those are the 4 questions I hope to answer over the course of this presentation. The executive summary, for those of you that don't want to waste time watching all the details, is that the speed of your computer is not that important. The size and speed of your storage is critical. There's little value in shooting 4K if your audience will never see it. Be very careful that you're not distracted by pixel envy. And shooting 4K images that are highly compressed will not yield as good an image quality as shooting 2K in an uncompressed format. Now, there are those that are going to disagree with these conclusions, but let me go through my reasoning in this presentation. Let's start with production. We have 4K cameras available from a variety of sources. There's GoPro with the Hero 3 Black at $399, JVC, Canon, Sony, Red, Vision Research with the industry leader Phantom 65 Gold, and here at BVE, 4A is showing the FT1, which has a US price of $135,000. Now that is a price range. We also have a wide variety of image sizes. PAL is that itty-bitty little thing tucked in the lower left corner. Then there's 1080p, which is 7 times bigger than PAL. The Blackmagic Cinema Design cameras, 24 by 1350. Ultra HD, 3840 by 2160. A 4K image is 4096 by 2160. And Red Epic is shooting a 5120 by 2700 image. Look at the difference in sizes. Even 4K has 2 different sizes, Ultra HD and 4K, both of which are arguably a 4K image. In fact, we have 2 different sizes depending upon how you decide to calculate the math. 3840 by 2160 basically takes a 1080 image, 1920 by 1080, and multiplies each dimension by 2. This is the easiest size to use when you're up-resing a 1080p image. The other size is 4096 by 2160. Now they came up with 4096 by taking one of the powers of 2, which is 2 to the 10th power. That yields 1024, and doubling it. So 1024 doubled and then doubled again yields 4096 by 2160. There's advantages to each, although it looks like the leading contender right now is 3840 by 2160. Not only do we have cameras that shoot different image sizes, we also have cameras that shoot different frame rates. For instance, the GoPro maxes out at 12 frames per second when it's shooting a 4K image. The Red Scarlet, the Sony f55 max out at 30 frames per second. All the other cameras shoot at least 60 frames per second. Here's a really important issue, and it's kind of hidden, and I want to spend a couple seconds talking about it. Not all cameras capture the full color image, what's called a 4:4:4 color space. Most reduce color capture by 50% to save space. They use what's called a Bayer pattern, and that's that image that's on the right. If you look at it really closely, look at any 4-pixel grid, and you'll see 1 red pixel, 1 blue pixel, and 2 green pixels. A Bayer pattern, which is used by many cameras, has twice as many green sensor sites as red or blue. What debayering does is it doesn't remove the green, it invents, a process called interpolation, additional data to make up for the missing red and blue pixels. It converts it from 4 to 2, 4 greens, 2 blues, and 2 reds, to 4:4:4. But this invention of additional data is actually just invented. You're not actually putting detail there. It's just filling in what it guesses to be the gaps. Now think about green screen keying. In a green screen key, we need to see really clear edges. But if half our color information's been invented, how accurate is the green screen key? It also begs the larger question of what's a pixel. Theoretically, a pixel is a single picture element which has unique red, green, and blue components. But in this particular case, we're using pixels to mean sensor sites. John Galt, the Senior Vice President for Imaging Technology at Panavision, said in a 2012 Creative Cow seminar that we perceive edge sharpness as contrast between the edge and what's behind it. Now, at normal theater distances, which is 2.5 to 3 times the screen height, when we view 4K, we can't see the sharpness at the pixel level because the pixels are too small. If we wanted to see the detail provided by the pixels in a 4K image, we would need to sit in the first 6 rows of a theater. Otherwise, our eyes don't see that extra image detail. Let me give you an example. There was a test made a few years ago where an engineer took a checkerboard and projected a single white and single black square onto a standard movie screen. Clearly, you could see the difference in the edge between the white and the black square. Then they doubled the pixels, and they showed 2 white and 2 black on a checkerboard pattern, and doubled it again to 8, and doubled again to 16 and 32, and kept doubling and kept doubling. And at each point, the pixels got smaller and smaller, until they finally showed a 4K image, 4,000 pixels, 2,000 white, 2,000 black, and the entire screen went gray. There were so many pixels projected on that screen that you could no longer see the edges between the white pixel and the black pixel, and because the edges disappeared, the screen, instead of being white chunks and black chunks, turned into a gray wash, which meant we didn't see the extra image detail. As John said in his presentation, if you want greater resolution, shoot at higher frame rates, not more pixels. The big problem that we've got with 24 frame a second video is motion blur. The frame is open so long, the image is being exposed for such a long time that movement has a decided blur to it. If you want to see a sharper, crisper image, shoot at 48 frames per second. Well, we've all heard the heresy involved in high frame rate film, whether it really looks like film or whether it looks like video. But the whole goal behind shooting 4K images is to provide greater realism, greater resolution, increased sharpness, and all those extra pixels may be leading us in the wrong direction. Do an experiment. shoots something at 60 frames a second, which is where I shoot my material, versus shooting at 24. Look how much crisper it looks. Now shoot at a lower resolution and a slower frame rate, and a higher resolution at a slower frame rate. Notice that that crispness does not translate to the extra pixels. We also have an issue with file storage. We record on a variety of capture media. There's dual CF cartridges and SSD cartridges, SDHC and SDHX cards, Red Mags, S/S Pro Plus cards, SR memory cards, even internal camera memory. Not all media supports high bandwidth recording, which is why compression, such as H.264, is necessary. For instance, SDH, both C and X cards, can't record at a high data rate. That's why H.264 is being used in all DSLR cameras. It's not that the camera can't generate uncompressed video, it's that the card itself can't record that video fast enough, and it would then drop frames. This is one of the reasons people take the output from the HDMI or HD-SDI connector and record that to a really fast hard disk so that they get the benefit of the high resolution without the artifacts that massive compression like H.264 dials into the video. The problem is we're now moving out of the area of small files into really, really big files. There's really two clumps of codecs. There's heavily compressed codecs, which create a loss of detail. These include H.264, MPEG-2 MXF, and XDCAM 422, which is a variant of MPEG-2. There's also less compressed, but not necessarily uncompressed, RAW files. But there's no one single RAW file. There's 10-bit log RAW files and Sony SR 12-bit. There's 12-bit and 16-bit redcode RAW files, which, even though it's labeled as RAW, are still compressed anywhere from 18:1 to 3:1, with the average compression rate being around 7:1. We also have 12-bit RAW with the Blackmagic design camera shoots, 14-bit linear RAW, even 16-bit linear RAW. Even RAW has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different flavors of varying amounts of compression and bit depth. We have two types of camera output, HDMI, which stands for High Definition Multimedia Interface, and HD-SDI, which is High Definition Serial Digital Interface. HDMI, because of the way it uses connectors, is better for short cable runs that don't require reconnection very often. You want to put the HDMI connector in and leave it connected. Don't keep breaking the connection. It's better for direct connections between gear, and it transmits audio and video. HD-SDI, in contrast, is better for longer cable runs because it runs over coax. It's better when signals need to be switched, as they would in a cable or broadcast plant. It uses coaxial cables with BNC connectors, which are much more durable. By the way, you want to know what BNC stands for? It stands for British Naval Connector. It was invented by the British Navy to have a way of connecting cables so they don't disconnect if you accidentally bump them. And the other benefit to HD-SDI is that it transmits audio, video, and timecode, which is essential if you want somebody reading timecode, say a script supervisor, by looking at a monitor rather than looking at the actual timecode on the camera. Well, if those are the issues with production, what are the issues with post-production? And it all revolves around file size. Bitrate determines how accurately we can digitally reproduce reality. Higher bit rates are, in general, more accurate. When we say we're dealing with an 8-bit bit rate, that means that we're using a combination of 8 ones and zeros, as you see illustrated here, to record a value of a number, say the volume of sound or the amount of red in a red sensor. 8-bit video gives us a range of values from 0 to 256. So every shade of red or every shade of black, white, and gray has 256 discrete steps between the absolute minimum of something and the maximum of something. When we move to 16-bit, however, we move from 256 values between the minimum and the maximum to 64,536 values between the absolute minimum and the absolute maximum. Now, the minimum, black, still stays pure black. The maximum, white, still stays pure white. The extremes remain the same. What we're adjusting is the difference in values we have between absolute black and absolute white. 16-bit clearly gives us far greater detail that we can record than 8-bit. However, bit rate also determines file size. Higher bit rates create larger files. A 16-bit file is twice as large as an 8-bit file. So we get greater accuracy, we get bigger files. When it comes to editing, 4K file sizes are enormous. And that's where this table on the right comes from. I just decided to do some simple multiplication. Let's say that we have a horizontal frame size of 4096 and a vertical dimension of 2160. So our frame is 8,847,000 pixels contained in that 4K frame. Now let's say we shoot 30 frames a second. So you multiply 30 times 8 million times the bit depth will take the maximum, which is 16. Which we convert the bits to the bytes, which is dividing the number by 8. We get 530 million bytes that have to be processed per second, which is 518K, or 506 megabytes per second for one uncompressed stream of 4K imaging. I mean, compression is almost mandatory. But as soon as you compress, it also reduces image quality, which is why you were shooting 4K in the first place. To store an hour of uncompressed 4K is 1.7 terabytes. So now the question is, why are we shooting 4K? If we start to compress it, which throws away detail, then why were we shooting 4K in the first place? Even if you plan to shoot 4K so you can edit 2K, for example, to reframe shots to make a wide shot, a close-up, you have all the storage and data transfer requirements of 4K because all of your source files are 4K. The images that you're pulling into your editing system are 4K. Scaling down to 2K affects render and output files, but not source files. Scaling the image does not reduce the amount of data stored on the disk, nor does it reduce the amount of bandwidth necessary to process it. It does, however, reduce the size of your final output files. Also, data rates themselves vary wildly. The GoPro camera, by the time it's done compressing the 4K image, drives a 12 frame a second image at 5.6 megabytes a second. Canon, using also H.264, is 6.25 megabytes a second. JVC, which is XD-Cam, is 18 megabytes a second. Sony XD-Cam is between 6.2 and 75 megabytes a second. Now there's a range. Red Co-Draw is up to 42 megabytes a second. Sony SR, 110 megabytes a second. And uncompressed, as we've seen, is up to 500 megabytes a second. All compression is lossy, meaning that some image detail or some color information is lost during compression. Here's an example. For the recent editing of The Hobbit, I interviewed Nicholas Ricagno, who provided technical support for the final online as part of the podcast Digital Production Buzz. In creating the final online master of The Hobbit, which was shot 48 frames per second, stereoscopic 3D, they were working with uncompressed 16-bit 4K files that required 2.2 gigabytes per second of data. Now that's twice as fast as a fully loaded RAID attached via Thunderbolt. And, he went on to say, the front side bus, that's the bus that carries data from the RAM to the CPU, is also a bottleneck because the maximum front side bus that we've got with current microcomputer technology maxes out at 2.3 gigabytes a second. I mean, we are at the point right now of the maximum data transfer speed, not between our storage and the computer, but between the RAM and the CPU. If we look at how our devices are connected, those in red, USB 2, FireWire 400, FireWire 800, or even a single internal hard drive, don't deliver speeds that are necessary for dealing with 4K images. USB 3 maxes out around 460 megabytes a second. Thunderbolt maxes at 1.1 gigabytes a second. However, if you connect a 4-drive RAID to Thunderbolt, you'll only get between 350 and 450 megabytes a second. Fiber Channel maxes out at 1.6 gigabytes a second. I mean, 4K is pushing up against the maximum data transfer rates that we can get from the high end of storage technology right now. Now, mini SAS can go faster, but still the storage and how you connect that storage to your computer is the chief bottleneck in being able to process really high-resolution images. Well, let's take a look now at output. We've decided to shoot 4K. We've decided that we're going to edit 4K. How do we output 4K? Phil Holland, who's the DP and VFX person behind Iron Man and X-Man, recommends the following 4-step process. He outputs a DPX file as a video master. Now, DPX are individual frames, so basically it's outputting a folder containing individual frames of the movie. He then outputs a WAV audio master, a .mov, which is an uncompressed QuickTime file, and a .mp4, which is a high bitrate MPEG-4 movie, which you can use for quick review because it'll be the smallest of all of them. The benefit to DPX files is that if you lose a DPX frame, you lose a frame. If you lose a frame contained in a QuickTime movie, you lose the entire movie because QuickTime requires the entire file to be complete before the QuickTime movie will play. And just so you can do the math yourself, one 4K DPX frame, which by definition is uncompressed, is about 50 megabytes in size. So 1 hour of DPX frames is about 180 gigabytes. And in addition to outputting our movie, how are we going to store these massive files for the long term? I mean, think about it. Most filmmakers make their profits on reuse of existing assets. Well, LTO tape is currently the only reasonable option, but LTO hardware is not inexpensive. The recommended lifespan of LTO is about 25 years, and it needs to be copied to new media every 3 hardware generations. The current version of LTO, LTO 6, came out in December of last year. LTO 6 will read and write LTO 6 format, read and write LTO 5, and read LTO 4. Which means that if you've got LTO 2 or 3 tapes, you've got to convert them to a relatively current version before you upgrade your hardware, because otherwise you won't be able to play back those tapes. The LTO spec says read-write the current version, read-write the version just before the current version, and read-only the version before that. It's only compatible with the last 3 versions, so you need to build into your budget some way of continuously updating your assets to the latest archiving technology about once every 8 to 10 years. Well, let's shift our focus over to distribution. Who's going to play these 4K images? Theatrical, broadcast television, cable, Blu-ray Disc, and the web. With Theatrical, while Sony has equipped most of its theaters for 4K, most theaters around the world exhibit at 2K. So here you are, you shot 4K, you edited 4K, you've output 4K, but you can't show 4K theatrically. Well, let's take a look at broadcast television. In late 2012, the ITU, which is the standards body that governs high-definition TV, adopted the UHD TV standard. Now, that stands for ultra-high-definition TV. That gives us a frame size of 3840 by 2160 because it scales smoothly from 1920 to 1080. However, although the standard has been adopted, whether and when broadcasters spend the money to implement this is an open question. Less than a decade ago, most broadcasters equipped their plants to handle the equivalent of 1080i images via HDSDI. And that involved significant image compression during the transfer, the broadcast of 1080i images. However, if we switch from 1080 to 4K, broadcasting 4K images, even with compression, would require increasing internal bandwidth by 8 times, which means a broadcaster essentially has to replace every piece of gear from ingest through to the transmitter. You can just imagine how excited they are. And there's rumbles that maybe 8K is the new standard. You know, broadcasters are conservative people. I don't expect this conversion to occur anytime soon. Or let's look at cable. Cable head ends are designed for 1080i images. while replacing the head end is relatively doable, cable would also need to replace all the last mile connections to the home to support the larger image sizes. Higher frame rates are easier to support than larger image sizes. Just think of the massive rewiring job to be able to support that kind of size to the home. Well, let's take a look at Blu-ray Disc. Blu-ray is probably the best option for 4K, but it's not widely installed. In January 2013, the ITU that we talked about earlier approved a new video codec, H.265, which is also called HEVC, which created a new standard for high-definition video storage. It encodes at 8-bit or 10-bit at a color sampling of 420, which is similar to the color sampling we have now on DVDs, but it uses half the bit rate of H.264. Standards with higher color fidelity of 422, 4x4, and 12-bit video are still in committee and not likely to show up in the near future. By the way, Sony just released a brand new 84-inch 4K video monitor, priced at just less than $25,000. Let's take a look at the web. While H.265 is being showcased by a variety of hardware and chip manufacturers, and I include Broadcom and Ericsson, Fraunhofer, Qualcomm, and others, it is not yet available in software-based encoders. Currently, the web is essentially a 720p world. Some monitors are capable of displaying pixel-accurate 1080p, but virtually no computer monitors and no mobile device, including laptops, is capable of displaying 4K. Again, it asks the question, is there a value in shooting 4K if no one can see it? So let me try and wrap this up. 4K may be the future, but it has some steep technical requirements. If higher resolution is your goal, shooting higher frame rates will yield greater results at less cost. If flexibility in editing is your goal, then pick a 4K format with little to no compression to minimize artifacts. If higher quality at distribution is your goal, consider releasing on Blu-ray Disc. And if future-proofing is your goal, shoot 2K at a high frame rate, which can be easily up-res to 4K when you need it. In all cases, give yourself time to test your 4K workflow to prevent surprises, because there's a reason they call it the bleeding edge. My name is Larry Jordan, and thanks for watching.